Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers from coast to coast around the globe and the Gulf to Canada. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take on all the video channels, YouTube, Gag Me, Google, Brighteon, Pradion, Gab, Truth, X, you name it. And please hit the subscribe, hit the like, pass this link and other shows like it onto your friends and relatives and people that you think need to know. The key here is getting information out so people can make decisions and be informed. Contrary to the omissions, errors, purposeful mistruths of the mainstream media, which, shall we say, has been disgraced in this last election. In fact, MSNBC is going to be put on the chopping block, the sales block, by Comcast, and you'll never guess who's going to buy it or who might buy it. Elon Musk. And you'll never guess who might be the primetime anchor. Maybe Tucker. We'll see what happens. It's going to be very interesting. So today, as promised, number one, I want to apologize. This is 4 days late. Number one, last week was the week from hell. And number two, the research that I did into the promised show on presidents like Trump who took over America at times of crisis or times of pending crisis and how they reacted to it. The steps that they took, the leadership that they portrayed, how it might give us a handle on how Trump may take things in stride, the actions he may take and the results for you, your finances, your freedoms, and your country. And in doing the research, it was way more entailed than I thought. It took way longer. One of the reasons for the delay in this show. I'm actually breaking the show into 2 parts. The next one I will do Wednesday. It'll come out Thanksgiving, and you'll have all weekend to peruse it and to listen to it and to absorb it, because it's really insightful. History is the touchstone of the past, and the touchstone of the past is the guidepost to the future. It never fails. It's one of the reasons they attack history, of course. So today we're going to cover 4 presidents. And, you know, in my research, I was surprised at what I came up with. And some of these presidents I'm not really fond of. In fact, a couple I just don't like at all. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I mean, I was surprised. But all of these men, along with Lincoln and Washington and Reagan and Teddy Roosevelt and Andrew Jackson, took over the country in times of great division, great strife, economic peril, and in some cases, international peril. Very similar, although maybe not quite as bad, as what we face today and the situation, the very perilous situation that we find our country in and ourselves as Americans in today. So this first show, if we have time, I'm trying to keep these shows limited to somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. That seems to be the audience's preferred time lapse, shall we say, on these presentations. So I'm going to break it into 2. Today we're going to try and cover, believe it or not, Herbert Hoover. Yes, and you'll see why when we get into it. And Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lincoln. And in the next show, several days from now, we'll finish this up with Andrew Jackson and Ronald Reagan. And by the way, today we're going to cover Washington too, because really of all the presidents, he really is the founder of the American nation. And he is the guiding light behind that saying, we are all Americans. And we'll get into that in just a moment. And then I'm going to have some rat-a-tat-tat for you, because the international situation grows more sinister, more precipice-like, the precipice of disaster And nobody's bringing this news. It's just incredible. And this is life and death news. Never mind all the other goodies that go into your daily lives and your freedoms and the existence of this country, I might add. So I'm going to bring you up to rat-a-tat-tat speed on international things that you really need to know, and I think your jaw will hit the table. Better put a cushion down because, boy, we are on the brink, and we are on the brink on purpose because of the neocons and the psychopaths who currently run this country and who are doing everything they can to sabotage it for Trump's incoming inaugural. And by the way, to punish us because we didn't go along with their globalist agenda. We didn't re-elect them, despite their fraud and shenanigans. Anyway, let's start, shall we say, with the founder's quote. And really apropos, I think, to these two shows that I'm bringing you, this one and the one in a few days. This is from George Washington. The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize, unquote. And you'll see why this quote is so apropos as we begin our kickoff on presidents who face perils and what they did about it in this show here in just a few minutes. First of all, though, the ranch story. This is going to be short, sweet, and I think bring you a little chuckle. So the other day, about a week early, just due to weather and the schedules of everybody, the cows that call this place, this beautiful place, home for the winter came in. They usually come in December 1st. Well, that got moved up. And I ran around because my ranch lieutenant is doing some family stuff right now on a trip. I ran around and made sure all the fences were fixed. He did a great job on that. I made sure the gates that were open so that the cows can wander hither, yither, and yon from field to field were open. And the gates that separate the cows from the horse pasture, because we don't like to mix them, were closed. And along the way, I had to fix two gates that somehow got wired into the fence. Don't ask me how that happened. If I can find out who did it, they'll have a bad day. And repaired several other little spots. But we got it all done. And the trucks came in right on schedule. And literally, they had all the cows unloaded in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Boom, done. 6 loads of cows. And the moral of this story is, if you are prepared and you are dealing with professionals, things will go like a hot knife through butter. Oh, yes, they will. And just the opposite is true, too. So, let's talk about the presidents and the times and the history of America that are similar to what we face today and similar to what Trump is going to face coming into a office that is being sabotaged by the minute by the departing psychopaths, communists, and globalists that we've rejected. So Washington, truly the founder of our country and the founder of things American, he knew that when he took office, he was petrified of the fact that he was the first president and that everything he did would set a precedent for all the presidents for hundreds of years thereafter. And he was also very worried about the fact that at that time in American history, following the revolution and the failed attempt at federal government up to the time of the ratification of the Constitution, that everything had become very localized. States thought they should be their own countries. Local demagogues played on people's fears and divisions. And the country was really in the process of being torn apart. There were states that actually wanted to go out and form their own countries. No longer a union, but 13 little countries, more or less, I guess, banded together. Remember that the population of America at that time was only 4 million people. That's it, 4 million. Pretty amazing. And he knew that the first thing he had to do was to unify the country, to consolidate the states into a federal country, into a federal republic, and to get the people off their localized thoughts and their state-oriented thoughts and get them thinking as they should in a country, that they were Americans. They were not Massachusetts. They were not North Carolina. They weren't South. They weren't North. He immediately called a bunch of meetings. Remember that the capital at that time was New York, not Washington, D.C. And he was inaugurated there. And he got part of this idea on his travels from Mount Vernon, his estate in Virginia, to his inaugural, because he was greeted by cheering throngs, thousands of people at every town and every bridge and every river crossing, all the way up to New York. And it gave him great heart because he could see that there was a spirit of unity to be fostered, to be cultivated, to be grown. And he always thought that his power was derived from the people. And therefore, the people needed to have communication with their government and the head cheese in the government. He called a bunch of meetings, black people, white people, people from the north, people from the south, rural, industrial, even women who at that time did not have the right to vote. Many women attended his meetings. And he got a feel for the collective thought out there. And he determined that he would take a trip, actually a number of trips, over the course, beginning immediately after his inauguration, over the course of a year or two. Remember that travel was outrageous in those days, right? Rutted dirt roads. There was no interstates, folks. It was horse and carriage or horse. And it took many, many, many days to travel from one spot to the other. He determined that he would take a trip and visit all 13 colonies to hear what the people had to say, to send them the message of America, not states, America, not towns, America, not Bostonians and Philadelphians and Americans, to unite the country into a common theme, which was, we are all Americans. And he accomplished this rather amazing feat over a 2-year period, 1789 to 1791. Remember that Washington saved this country 3 times. First, he saved the country by keeping the Continental Army alive despite untold hardships, untold setbacks, defeats, disease, freezing temperatures, lack of food. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And he kept the country alive, he saved the country when, after the Revolutionary War, the military, a large portion of the military, in fact, headquartered out of Newburgh, New York, decided that they were going to have a coup. They were going to conduct a coup against the United States feeble government at that time because their continental dollars that they had been paid were worthless. In other words, they had not been paid for their services as promised. And the coup was led by none other than Alexander Hamilton, which is a very interesting story as it evolves in history. Alexander Hamilton and Washington, of course, became close in the long run, and Hamilton served several positions in his government, including treasurer. But at that time, they were opposed, and Washington himself went up to Newburgh and met with Hamilton, and he told him that their power came from the people, not from the army and not from the government. And that, I quote, "The army is a dangerous thing to play with in politics," unquote. Alexander Hamilton and his, shall we say, second-tier revolutionaries stood down. The country was saved a mess, as kind of a second revolution. And Washington believed that the new country, the threads that bound this new country were tenuous, but could be strengthened into a fabric. And he sent emissaries, and in some cases personally talked to the local demagogues in Philadelphia and Boston and New York and Charleston And all the big centers, even back then, the big centers were, shall we say, the breeding grounds of anti-American thought. How's that? I'll be nice. And basically he told them, either you get on board or you get kicked off board. Washington was not a socially adept man. Oh, yeah, he loved to dance and he liked ladies and all that kind of stuff, but he was not socially adept. In fact, in his own words, he said, quote, "I am a man of action, not expression," unquote. And action is exactly what he took. He understood, however, that, and I quote, "I walk on untrodden ground," unquote. In other words, he knew that he was the first in a long line of American presidents, and everything he did would affect the future. He believed that people would rise to the occasion, and I quote, "if they know the truth," unquote. That's right. Quote, "if they know the truth," unquote. Which is what this show tries to bring you, other shows like this brings you, and the mainstream media purposely does not bring you. And the left purposely wants to withhold from you because people cannot react with any measure of alacrity or thought or reason if you don't know the truth. And Washington succeeded. The quote I gave you was from his farewell inaugural, and he was well pleased with the way America's states had bound themselves together into a nation and the progress, extreme progress, that had been made in people all over the country, all over the 13 colonies and later Vermont. How they had moved past mostly their local prejudices, their local affiliations, and begun to think of themselves as a people, as Americans. And he did it by example. He did it by communication. He did it by having a plan and following it. Which brings us to the next president that we're going to talk about, Herbert Hoover. And some of you might be scratching your heads going, Herbert Hoover? Yes, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is a really interesting character. He served many posts in several administrations. He was a humanitarian, and he was really responsible for saving many people, in millions, in fact, in Europe from starvation. He was also Commerce Secretary under two presidents, Coolidge and I'll think of the guy's name in just a moment, but Coolidge was one of them. And he was responsible for building the St. Lawrence Seaway. Think of this, way back then. And the Hoover Dam. That's right. Now think about what projects those would be even in today's times and having today's machines and technological abilities. But he got them built. He was a man of action also. Unfortunately, 8 months after he was elected in 1929, after he was inaugurated in 1929, we had the stock market crash in the beginnings of the Great Depression in October. And Hoover, who had been born in West Branch, Iowa, in fact, the very first president born west of the Mississippi, as a little historical factoid, he had run against New York Governor Alfred E. Smith. He had won in a landslide, by the way. And during his campaign, and these words would come back to haunt him, to bite him, and to eventually kick his butt out of the White House when he lost the election in a landslide to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. Quote, "We in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of the land," unquote. Well, that's kind of like George Bush Sr. saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." People remembered that quote. And in the middle of the Great Depression, they did not forgive him for it. His plan to attack the Great Depression, which he had not seen coming, his economic advisors had not seen coming, and which he was totally unprepared for, took him by surprise like everybody else, had as its backbone tax cuts and public work projects. While I'm telling you these stories, think about today's events, today's situation, and what Trump is telling us he plans to do. And I think you will be able to interpolate what things might work, what things might not, what things might backfire, what things might gain traction, and where we might be headed if everything Trump is talking about is implemented relative to what's happened in history. Hoover also contacted business leaders. He urged them not to cut wages, not to lay off workers. And he established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a federal lending institution intended to help banks that were weak stay on their feet, because there were lots of bank closures, and banks that were strong continue to expand and thrive, and also to help industries in their recovery efforts. But he made a critical mistake, even though he made some of the right moves, by signing the Smoot-Hawley Act. And the Smoot-Hawley Act raised taxes, can you say tariffs, on imports, and increased prices. And it prompted foreign nations basically to turn their backs on American-made goods. And this was at a time that the country desperately needed sales. I mean, we were a manufacturing country at that time, not a service and consumer-based economy at that time. Hoover has not gone down in the history books as one of the great presidents, but he tried to lead by example. He exhibited the traits of leadership. He rose, unfortunately, with one major mistake, the Smoot-Hawley Act, which undermined all his other good moves. He rose to the occasion of an unknown and calamitous event, the Great Depression. And that leads us to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, by the way, is one of my least favorite presidents for many reasons. He was an extension of the Woodrow Wilson progressive thought. He believed in sharing the wealth, or should I say redistribution. And he believed in far too much power of the executive branch. And I've brought you his history. You can go back in the archives and listen to the history of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's fascinating. But when Roosevelt began his presidency, it was the height, the pinnacle of the Great Depression. And like Lincoln, whom we're going to talk about next, FDR had to act for the greater good when people were hurting. Not from war, in this case, like Lincoln, as we'll discuss, but from economic collapse, literally collapse. And his leadership was not so much visionary, but it was turnaround. LBJ, who we're going to discuss, was more of a visionary. Lincoln was transformative, as we will also be discussing. And Teddy Roosevelt was a master of crisis management. In FDR's case, the entire financial system had basically collapsed. He called a bank holiday to close all the banks so he could figure out how to reopen them with an emergency banking bill that would shore up the weaker banks and let the stronger ones go forward, kind of like what Hoover tried to do in the term before him. But he understood that people were scared, that people were hurting, and that people in some way, shape, or form blamed themselves for the catastrophes that they were facing and that the country was facing. And he determined, kind of like Washington, early on that he had to get the confidence, he had to get the faith of the people back in themselves, in him, in government, and in America. And he did his famous fireside chats, you've heard about them, once a week. And it endeared him to the people. When he gave his inaugural address, his main concern was reinstilling that confidence back in Americans. And they were very badly frightened people at that time. He told them, quote, "It's the system that's at fault, and we are going to take action to make that system fairer. And if I don't get Congress to go with me, I'm going to take executive powers to do it," unquote. His optimism, his confidence in that very first speech, his inaugural address, turned the mental tide of Americans. And it was critical because, you know, if you don't believe you can do it, you sure as hell are not going to. And he used his polio. You know, you've seen pictures of him in a wheelchair. I mean, the guy was, since he was young, stricken with polio, could barely walk, in fact, could barely stand, could barely get out of the wheelchair. But he didn't hide it, kind of like Abbott today, the governor of Texas. He used it to instill confidence in people. When he struggled to his feet in giving a speech, he knew the whole nation was watching him with kind of a dread premonition that he wasn't going to make it, that he was going to fall over or whatever. And he demonstrated to people using that physical ailment of his that grit and determination can overcome even the greatest setbacks. The country really saw him not as a cripple in a wheelchair, but because of his attitude, because of his leadership, because of his communications, and because of his example. They saw him as this big, strong, strapping, big-chested guy, which of course he was not. But he created the impression that he was, and he created the impression that this big, strong, strapping, broad-chested guy who actually was in a wheelchair and could barely stand was a leader that they could trust and that they could follow. And he rescued the country from its own, as Jimmy Carter would say, mental malaise or malaise. And he did a phenomenal job. I don't agree with a lot of stuff he did. We're still kind of fighting it today. But nonetheless, he created the platform from which America emerged finally with the advent of World War II, a whole nother tale in FDR's history, from the Great Depression. And in doing so, earned his spot in this presentation I'm giving you. Because if you think about what's going on today and what was going on in the roaring 20s, this is really kind of the roaring 20s of the 21st century. There's a lot of things going on today which parallel, which mirror what was happening pre-Depression in the 1920s, but probably on steroids. We didn't have the national debt we do now. We didn't have the international precarious, really precarious situations. We didn't have nuclear weapons. We didn't have technology. We didn't have communications. But nonetheless, the 1920s and where we are right now in American history, economic and otherwise, do have a eerie similarity. Which brings us to Teddy Roosevelt, quite the character. Within weeks of Teddy Roosevelt taking command of the Army during the Spanish-American War, remember he was a Rough Rider, he said that he knew that his soldiers, most of them were better horsemen than he was. Most were better athletes than he was. Most were better marksmen than he was. However, he knew that he was their leader. And he manifested this leadership, as did Washington, as did Hoover in his own way, as did Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He manifested this leadership, this personality, this ability to communicate, this capacity to make people believe in a mission, in a task, in a plan. Remember that at that time, America was on the cusp of becoming a world-dominating power. We had just acquired Philippines and the Guam in the Spanish-American War. And Cuba had become kind of a protectorate, if you were, due to that war. But America was facing some serious economic problems. We were in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was making, think of this in today's parlance, making the industrialists, the elite, very wealthy, and squashing down the working class. In other words, the wealth disparity effect that we see today, by the way, although prompted by other industries and circumstances. And Roosevelt also knew that America, still a fledgling country, really, when he took over, but fully incorporated, with the exception of Hawaii and Alaska, fully incorporated into a continental, cohesive whole, had tremendous natural resources that needed to be preserved. And he knew that some of his ideas would never get through Congress. And he was not afraid of using the power of the pen to get things done. He believed that Americans needed a sense of common mission to overcome this disparity, this social disparity, this wealth disparity, to get the rural areas that were losing population like crazy to the cities because of the Industrial Revolution and all the things that were going on at that time. He thought that Americans needed a common mission, and that was to be Americans. Back to George Washington's idea, we are all Americans. And he became president, I might add, and he, at the age of 42, the youngest president ever in American history, still to this day. And he became president after the assassination of President William McKinley in September of 1901, not long after he had taken the oath of office. Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president. Roosevelt was committed, like Washington, like the other presidents that I'm telling you about, to making government work for the people. And he believed, as Washington and the other presidents did, that the power of the presidency and the government comes from the people. One of the things he sought to do was to regulate the big business trusts of the day, because they were exercising monopolistic power. And some of the laws enacted during his tenure still stand today. Many of the antitrust statutes, which the government still uses today to break up monopolies, may they do that with Google quickly. And he picked on the railroads. He picked on organized labor. He was even-handed in picking on people. And the processed food industry. He was a conservative by nature, but he's progressive in many of his ideas, kind of like Trump. You know, Trump is a conservative, but has progressive tendencies, maybe from his long stint in New York or otherwise. He exercised his executive powers as an equal branch of government. And he was the one who really got going the whole thought of executive powers that Delano Roosevelt, by the way, later kind of capitalized on and expanded, and as other presidents since then have expanded. Remember Obama? I have my phone and I have my pen. Yeah, okay, whatever. And he's using it, by the way, at the end of his third term to our detriment, intentionally. But that's a whole, we'll get into that in the rat-a-tat-tat. Teddy Roosevelt, felt that if the Constitution did not specifically deny the president the exercise of power, the president was at liberty to exercise that power. And he used that power, no matter what you may think of its use, to establish 51 national bird sanctuaries, the national parks, the national forests, the predecessor to the Bureau of Land Management. I've brought you the history of the Bureau of Land Management. He's the one responsible for all those great pieces of Americana land that have been preserved. Now, many can talk about why. Many can talk about some ulterior motives by the government. You'll notice national parks control the headwaters of all the major waterways in the United States from which people transport, drink, irrigate, you name it. But nonetheless, he did that. And he rallied the people. He had the people overcome what was becoming a very divisive wealth disparity issue. He bound the various social classes together into a common thought. We are all Americans. We can solve this. We can make it fair. And in fact, he coined the phrase the square deal. Later on, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would expand on that a little bit and call it the New Deal. But the square deal was basically not so much taking from the rich and giving to the poor, not today's progressive communist mentality, but in terms of creating a level playing field so that labor could compete effectively for wages and jobs against businesses and conglomerates and monopolies that Roosevelt tore apart because they were all too powerful in controlling prices, wages, and jobs. He was an unbelievably energetic character. Remind you of anybody? And he was a fiery character. Remind you of anybody? And he was not afraid to say what he thought. Okay, I'm sure he would have had a hell of a time and had an account on X and been blasting on it every day. Does that remind you of anybody? It was very much when McKinley was assassinated, which of course shocked the country. And by the way, the same as what brought LBJ into a position of leadership when Kennedy was assassinated. We'll talk about him in the next segment of this, or the second part of the show. But you had rural areas cut off from the cities. You had lots of immigrants coming in. That was the second great American immigration, of course, most of it legal. And they were threatening wages and jobs, just as the illegal immigration of today is. And he was a fiery proponent of centrist philosophy, the square deal, right? It's going to be a square deal for everybody, rich and poor, capitalist and wage worker, black and white, north and south, didn't matter. Everybody had an equal platform from which to rise. Some of his sayings: speak softly and carry a big stick. Don't hit until you have to, but when you have to hit, hit hard. And even the Maxwell House coffee slogan, good to the very last drop, they all come from Teddy Roosevelt. As a little interesting historical factoid, while president, he attended the wedding of his niece, Eleanor, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were distant cousins. Just a really interesting little factoid, right? Yes. I love the little warps and twists of history. Which brings us to Lincoln. So Lincoln is quite a character. Unlike the Roosevelts, who grew up in kind of Eastern elite and wealth, unlike Hoover, who kind of worked his way up the ladder, unlike Washington, who was landed gentry way back when, Lincoln grew up poor. And his biggest, or one of his biggest traits, was resilience. He had overcome poverty. He lost his first several elections, but kept on a-coming. He just never went away. He was dogged in his pursuit of his goals. And that resilience in his personality, he was able to manifest because he was a great orator. He was able to manifest to the people of the country, particularly the Union, the North. And he took over right before, literally right before, 600,000 Americans were to die in a civil war. He had extraordinary empathy for people. He even understood where the South was coming from in their fight against the North. That did not deter him from his absolute goal of preserving the Union. But he understood the folks that at that time were his fellow American enemies. And once the North had won the war, in his inaugural address in his second term shortly before he was assassinated, That inaugural address says much about Lincoln and how he led and how he bound the North together, and then later, using empathy, using forgiveness, rebound the country, North and South, into an American country, into the we are all American thought process. And in that second inaugural address, he said, quote, both sides read the same Bible, both prayed to the same God, and neither one's prayers were fully answered. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up a nation. And he was merciless, too. He had a tough side. He mercilessly prosecuted the war. Sherman's march through Georgia, burning and torching everything in his path. He was patient. He was persevering. And of course, he had that gift for language. He's an extraordinary character. And he had those same qualities of leadership, that same grand plan, that same feeling that his power derived from the people, that America was to be kept intact, that America was a nation, not a bunch of states, not a North and South, and that Americans were all Americans, not Northerners and Southerners, or city people and rural people, or blacks and whites. And this is a common theme you see through all these presidents who managed the affairs of the country in times of huge uproar and peril. In the second installment, I'm going to bring you LBJ. Quite an interesting tale, kind of a surprise entry, because I don't like LBJ at all for many reasons, into my little list of presidents who brought the nation through trauma by fear, but by pure willpower, by pure force of personality, by dedication and belief in a common goal, and the ability to communicate that common goal to everyone so that they understood it, so that they bought into it, so that they believed in the leader who was telling them what the common goal was. Think about this as you think about where we are right now, economically, internationally, militarily, in terms of freedoms, in terms of assaults upon the Constitution, in terms of the left's willingness to try and divide us along all sorts of nefarious paths. Their wish to create victims rather than Americans. I'm not an American, I'm a victim. And think about Trump. And think about what he said he's going to do. And think about how that may affect the country, the economy, the military, our international standing, the dollar, and your lives and your freedoms, and the financial and personal physical safety of you and your family. Now let's get into rat-a-tat-tat, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happening with, it's just a friggin' mess over in Ukraine. And Biden, Obama's third term, and the globalists are doing everything they can to make it a bigger mess at our peril. One of the things that Biden just did, literally today, I'm almost glad I was late on the show, is that he is now talking with France and Britain about actually giving Ukraine nuclear weapons. I want you to think about that for just a moment. It's friggin' unbelievable. It's insane. It's psychotic. And they don't care, folks, because they don't care about you. They care about their ideology. They care about their globalist wishes and wants. They are fit to be tied that the globalist agenda has been basically booted off the podium in all sorts of Western countries, and most recently and most pronouncedly here in the United States. And I honest to God believe that they would almost welcome the punishment of nuclear winter for the Americans who have thrown them out of office. How dare they, those commoners, those garbage people, those deplorables, those skags, you know all the things you've been called. Well, let me tell you some other little facts here about what's going on in Ukraine leading up to this. We might give them nuclear weapons. I mean, holy moly. All right, let's do a little rat-a-tat-tat because you need to be apprised of some stuff that's going on, which could affect the planet, never mind the United States, rather detrimentally. And nobody seems to want to talk to you about it. And we have some videos posted that will give you further details on what I'm bringing you. As always, the articles, etc., are on the website on therightsideradio.com. So, analysts are looking at the foreign situation, and of course, you have the hawks, and you have the doves, and you have the pundits. But here's the bottom line: I don't care what they tell you or what they think. What's going on is rather alarming. Okay, the war in Ukraine is escalating dramatically. France, England, and the United States have okayed long-range missiles into Russia, and Ukraine's been launching them, and Putin and the Russians are not very happy about it. I'm talking about 1,000, 1,200 or more kilometers into Russia. Additionally, Biden, I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's not Biden. I mean, it's Obama and the rest of the crew, have decided that they're going to give the most advanced long-range missile that can go even further, like 2,000 miles, to Ukraine and carry a heavier payload. To make it really easy, Russia's really not happy about that. It's almost like they're trying to engender something nasty happening between now and inaugural day. They wouldn't do that, would they? I mean, the deep state would never think of doing that, would they? North Korea is sending another 100,000 troops to fight alongside Russians in the Ukraine conflict. Two cables, big, huge communication cables, have been cut from Europe, one to Finland and one to Latvia. They think the Chinese did it at Russian behest. I mean, this is kind of like big news. Okay, Russia came out with a new nuclear doctrine. I'm hopeful that either this show or the next will have the entire doctrine. You can read it for yourself, translated to English, of what he's saying. But basically what he's saying is, look, if you attack me with sophisticated conventional weapons, and I know which country it's coming from, and obviously he does, because Britain and France and the United States have been big-mouthed about what they're supplying to Ukraine, and Russia knows full well that these things can't be operated without American, British, and French personnel, NATO personnel. I'm going to nuke you. I'm going to nuke the source. And I'm going to nuke the place of emanation of these missiles, etc. We're on this is razor thin, folks. We're on the precipice here. And we do not have the most competent leadership in the White House right now. Think about the great men I just talked about. Whether you like an individual or you don't out of that bunch, think about what they did for the good of the country. What's happening right now is not for the good of the country. It's for the good of the deep state. It's for the good of those who wish to maintain power. It's for the good of the industrial complex that makes money on war. But you know all this. Then we have Iran and Israel. Iran's kind of hanging back on a massive counterattack to the Israeli attack of several weeks ago. Israel's kind of biding its time. Part of this is Trump's influence. I'm not sure Iran really wants to get crossways with Trump more than they are. But eventually it's going to happen, particularly as their proxies get more and more decimated by the Israelis. So that's a powder keg waiting to blow, kind of a slow fuse on it. The deep state is petrified. Okay, Matt Gaetz had been nominated to be the Attorney General. I wasn't sure I liked that nomination, but his replacement, now that he's kind of out of the loop, is Pam Bondi, who is terrific. and a hell of an attorney, and tougher than nails, former state attorney general of Florida, the free state of Florida. And she is famous for saying in 2023 that if she ever got in a position of power, she would investigate the investigators and prosecute the prosecutors. So the deep state, which was going through mental chaos because of this election, is now like in double jeopardy. And don't think that they will not strike back. These people are not going to go down without a fight. You can see what's happening in all the Trump resistance nonsense that's beginning to spring up, and the BS that the Democrats, their age-old play. You can't argue with the policy and you can't argue with the skills, so we will attack the character of Trump's nominations. And then we have the most blatant example of election fraud ever, perhaps, in American history. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania was adamant 3 days before the election that you could not count ballots which were late, which were mismarked, which signatures didn't match, or whatever was wrong with them. Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is about as corrupt, which is saying a lot, as Maricopa County, Arizona, decided they were going to count the ballots anyway, and they did it in the open. And the county commissioner there, the head babe, and it could have been a guy, it doesn't matter, the head treasonous person there crowed about it on video, on TV, saying that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania doesn't mean much and court precedents really doesn't have any bearing anymore. And they just started counting ballots in the recount between Casey and McCormick, the Republican. McCormick has now won. Casey conceded because when the Democrats' plan, spearheaded by their nasty scumbag attorney Elias, who's committed more election fraud probably than any human being on the face of the planet, doesn't matter what country. When their plan fell through and the Supreme Court jumped in again, I think it was 3 days ago or 2 days ago, and said, no, you're going to stop counting now. Everything you counted, you're going to throw in the waste paper basket. And our former order rules the day, and you better follow it. And finally, they stopped. But not before this county commissioner election official said, well, this is the wrong decision, and, if given a chance, I'll do it again. I mean, this lady needs to go to jail. This is a prime example of why there has to be consequences to your actions. Okay, there has to be accountability. Anyway, the news is good out of Pennsylvania. Casey conceded. McCormick is the new senator by about 30,000 votes. I mean, that's how much your vote means, folks. There are millions of votes cast in Pennsylvania. So don't think your vote doesn't matter. It matters. There still remains, I believe, 2, there might be 3, excuse me, House races out there, and the House majority for the Republicans is razor thin. I mean, it's razor thin. And several representatives, even though they're from supposedly firmly red districts, are leaving to go to other posts. Stefanik to UN ambassador, another congressman to another position, and Gates has resigned, although he could serve because he was reelected. I mean, it's razor thin. And it's important that we win these last races. Once again, on the rightsideradio.com, go to the Take Action page or the recommended contribution page and send the legal teams, the links are right there for you, $10, $5, $20, whatever you can and feel like doing. We need to firmly, as much as you can with 3 or 4 votes, control the House. We don't want a 1 or 2 vote margin here. The Republican ranks still have rhinos, and the Democrats are still Democrats. And if you want to see Trump's vision, think about our historical story and his policies enacted in this time of great peril for the country. They better have the House, and by more than 1 vote. So get involved, send $10, send $20, send 15, send 5, do something. on the rightsideradio.com. Take action, recommend a contribution, please. And do it now, like right after this show. And get some other people to do it too. Pass this link on. All right, so that's your quick rat-a-tat-tat. As they said in the Old West, watch your top knot. Make sure you don't get scalped. Keep the wind at your back. I'll talk to you in the next few days with the next installment of History and the Presidents Who Shaped It. Read Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Have a great couple of days and what's left of this weekend.
Please remember, if you've missed any shows, just click on Show Archive and you'll find all of his shows. We look forward to seeing you here again next week for another episode of Read Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.